Thank you so much for joining us for this Leading Change episode. My name is Emma. I have Kevin with me today, and we're going to be talking about guardrails for innovation and how we can help maybe get the risk-averse going. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, Kevin, can you give everybody a real quick introduction?
Hi, thank you, Emma. My name's Kevin Gaut. I am the CTO at Instanda. I've spent all of my life, all of my career delivering solutions into the financial services. I spent a little bit of time working for one of the UK's leading insurance companies, heading up architecture for them. So I've seen a lot of organizations look to try and implement technology, look to try and implement innovation. And so I've got a few insights on what has made that successful and what hasn't, and hopefully I'll share that today.
Great. Well, I appreciate you joining me. And I think let's start with probably a little bit of that background that you just mentioned and talk through, through that experience. What has been the most common misconception that you've seen popping up time and time again that leads to failures when it comes to actually implementing technology?
I think there are two. When you think about failure, there's obviously the physical failure to actually get the thing implemented. And then I think the other part of failure is where organizations fail to realize the benefits of what the technology change they're trying to implement. The first one, there's lots of reasons why projects and things fail. Often, things take too long. We're fortunate in the age that we live today that you can implement software, you can implement change a lot quicker. And the quicker that you can implement change, then it's less impacted by changes in direction, changes in strategy, and you can see those benefits. But however, when it comes to software being implemented and then being successfully used within an organization, I would say the biggest thing for me is when an organization doesn't consider the operating model. They think that the technology itself will deliver the change. The technology might enable the change, but actually, if you want to realize the benefits, you need to think about your operating model. Examples would be, and I think anyone listening or watching would know, is often you set up the team with the people who know best about your existing processes, but they're not necessarily the team that's set up for change. So when you ask them, how do you want to move forward? What they do is they just describe the way they work today, which often ends up meaning that the system you're building looks like the system that you've got today. So one thing would be to have people who can think differently, can think outside the box of what they do today to what could it be like? What could it be? What could you imagine it's going to be in 2 to 3 years' time? And then it's about creating the operating model that you want to run in. So often within financial services, people have talked about speed of change. Well, one of the systems are not the influencing factor on speed to change. There's no point having a system that you can change your rates or your pricing within minutes if it's going to take you months to go through your sign-off process. So you have to think about that whole operating model, including who is going to do the change. With modern systems, we've moved out of all change needs to be happened in an IT paradigm into a world where the change is now done by the business. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that the business is empowered to make those changes, obviously within the safety that you want as an organization to apply. But that's how you get, I think, the real change is when you think about everything holistically, the system you're implementing and who's helping you build that and implement that, through to how you're going to run that and control it moving forward. And some examples I've seen, certainly in the UK, I worked with a large insurer around personal lines rating. And they completely reimagined what rating would be, what pricing would be like. And they applied that imagination into the software that we were implementing. And it meant that they went from changes every couple of months to hundreds of changes in a day. And they became, they won awards internally for the amount of change they were able to deliver. But that was where people were brave and they thought about that whole end-to-end process.
You're coming after my heart when you start using the word enabler. That is
Yeah.
one of my favorite ways to talk about technology, to remind people of that people or process side, whether it's talking about the operating model or simplifying it down to specific processes. I think that this idea is so critical for actually getting across the finish line with technology. And when you're talking about financial services, and I teased this at the beginning, this advice of starting with the operating model and thinking about people, process, and then technology is certainly widespread across all industries. But when we take a look at financial services and insurance specifically, we're a risk of averse crew.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So, what have
It's
you
in the
found?
nature of the industry, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's no getting around it at this point. So what have you found are great ways to kind of like enable that like innovative thought and maybe moving away from some of that fear as we're trying to kind of actually spur innovation?
Well, as we talked about when we were just chatting before we went on air, I worked in an organisation where I chaired an innovation forum, and one of the MDs for the business came and said he wanted innovation as long as it was already in budget and everyone knew what it was. So it is a challenge, and can be a challenge depending on the organisation. However, I'm really excited by modern technology and modern IT. We can implement change and innovation in a much quicker time frame than we ever used to be able to do it, and it's enabled really thinking about agile in the small a, not agile the method, about what is it exactly that you want to change, and then try it. You can test and learn now. The thing, if you want to try something out, it's easy to use no-code platforms to do that. If you want to try something out in policy, if you want to try something in rating, if you want to try something out in data, the growth of the cloud and other areas means that you can have access to these capabilities in a much safer, quicker way. And so the lesson would be, everyone kind of doesn't want to hear the lesson, but it's fail fast. That's absolutely key when it comes to innovation. If it's not going to work, then what you want to do is you want to get out before you've spent too much money or made too much commitment. So it's like thinking about the ideas that you've got. Think small. How can you test them? How can you try them out? How can you get a small group of customers to try that out? Is that going to work? Or when I say customers, it could be internal or external. And then try those out. See whether that changes, that innovation is sticky, seeing it's going to drive the results that you want, sorry. And that will be how you really kind of start to grow innovation in the business. Once you take that step back and think about what you're going to do and start to build out that service, then actually, when it gets to a point, it can become part of what you do, rather than it goes from just pure innovation to being something that is more business as usual. And all of the great changes that I have seen and been involved in, we started really small. We worked on building a data business where the first thing we started to do is look at and understand and pull out data and understand the data from the systems that were processing and the data we were seeing running through that. And then that was the first step. So, kind of innovation, let's get hold of the data. And then we looked at the data and said, well, what can we start to do with that data? So rather than, think about everything, we kind of came up with 3 or 4 ideas, and then we started to test those. Started to say, well, okay, if we combine that data, would we provide insights to insurers, or would we provide capability for brokers to write more business? Or what we did is, with just a few people, think about those and build proof of concepts, go out, show them. Those that people were interested in, we took further on and started to create fully fledged products. And you can do that across the business. So that doesn't necessarily need to evolve new IT systems. And that, again, I think that's a little bit of a misconception when it comes to innovation, especially with the kind of small I. What you could do is think about an existing process or where you're working. Could you make it faster, better, easier? And then why not try it? Obviously, in the boundaries of what you can work in. And yes, we work in a very risk-averse environment. But if you're not if you're not impacting the crown jewels, if you're not going to, risk millions on this thing, then you can try that process out, making small improvements. Within my own team, I very much encourage the idea of the game of inches, which is, you every day you just improve a little tiny bit. And that's about little tiny bits of innovation across the business, about, looking at the way that we test, looking at the way that we build. Can we introduce AI to help what we're doing? Can we introduce, different ways of doing things, trying it out, seeing what works, seeing what benefits we can give. And that way we've moved significantly on without ever having a big innovation program and, big fanfares and logos and everything. But we've fundamentally changed the way that we work and the way we think about change without those big programs. So summary, resist the big programs, think of really small things, and then, it might be, work from there, rather than it become big and scary. Just pick small things, work on those. And then I think you can then really create and embed innovation in your any organization.
There's a couple of things I want to comment on. One, I wish I was cool enough, but it was very British of you to talk about like impacting the crown jewels. Like,
sorry,
I can't make those kind of jokes here.
When we say crown jewels, we basically mean, the core the big things.
I know, but like, I love
what's
it.
What's the biggest thing that we're at risk? But sorry,
this is why having connections all around the world is so much fun, is you get to hear these little like sayings and things that people have that pop up along the way.
If you've been to England, we look after the crown jewels quite well. They're in a big parcely thing, and there's a lot of people looking after them. So what you want to do is you don't want to go touching those.
Yeah, and then you also brought up such a good point when it comes to kind of like incremental change. I think that there is this idea that innovation has to be big, and it has to be something that happens all at one time, or you're not moving the needle. And I always caution people with that mindset, because again, like you're talking about or a little bit earlier, failing fast, if you're putting everything towards one big innovation, you're going to do everything you can to make that thing happen and try to be successful with it. And you're going to have so much of like the sunk cost fallacy that plays into things, and not wanting to step away when you start to realize things are going awry. And I think that's part of why I dislike digital transformation, because it makes it sound like it's this like metamorphosis of like the little worm to the butterfly, and it's this one-time big thing that happens, as opposed to more of like an evolution, like we've seen play out with the companies that are actually successful with innovation and change. Amazon looks very different than it did when it first started. They've been innovating from the very beginning, but it's happened with slow steps along the way, and features and benefits that have been coming up. They didn't all of a sudden go from like brick and mortar to what we know today with this big bang. So I really love that point and that mindset.
If you take that idea, Amazon or Google, a lot of the Google things start off as like in little skunkworks innovation projects. Famously Google Maps started there. And that's, I think you really hit on it. The more money that you have at risk with this thing, the more vested interest in you have to make it work. Mm-hmm. And that's when you say about like the risk-averse. That's the money factor in it. The bigger it is, the harder it is to explain it's going to fail. And you're talking to someone who's, in my career, I've kind of had to go and tell people that the thing we were building for the last year isn't going to work. We're going to have to change
Not
direction.
An easy spot to be.
Not an easy, it's kind of one of those conversations where you go, there could be two outcomes, and one of them involves me not working here after this conversation. So sometimes you have those big things, but if you create it small and you can think about it, within your own team or within your own organization, that it doesn't involve change. It might be just improving the way that you communicate with each other, or changing the way the system is worked, taking one screen out when it's currently two. They don't sound like innovation, but what you're constantly doing is you're constantly moving forward. You're not accepting the way that we work today is the best way of working. Mm-hmm. And that you're not risking a huge amount of money. You're not, it's not career defining. And that's the other thing. I think people get worried that they come and it becomes too career defining. Your failure is seen as a bad thing. Actually, we've all got here because we failed loads but we've
Yeah.
learned by that. But somehow we do treat in the corporate world, because it's a big thing, failure is not, is not something that you take and learn.
Well, and for leaders that are trying to figure out how to build like the psychological safety to allow for fast failures, that's how you do it, is you make the
Yeah.
stakes come down a little bit in terms of what someone feels like is riding on the success. Nobody's, even if it's not an expensive failure, no one wants to go to their boss and say something didn't work out. They're still going to be motivated to try and make it work, but it brings down the stakes and it gives the freedom of the movement that actually has to happen to think of these new ideas that nobody else is doing.
Yeah, and that's, again, that's a really, I think you've gone and touched on a good point, which what you want is, you want leaders who go, hey, I did that wrong, who admit that that's the other part. It's like, again, it's like, depending on the organization, you need authentic leadership that says, I don't want to work, but like you can ask my own team. The other week we had a team meeting, and I like pondered it all weekend, and then sent them a note and said, that's the worst team meeting I've ever run. I'm so sorry to have wasted an hour of your time. I will promise to make it better. But if you don't see that, I mean, I'm not putting myself on any pedestal. I'm just saying, but if I only got that and was able to do that, because I've seen that from other leaders I've worked with, if you've got that environment where people are prepared to accept their failures and say, I'm going to learn from that and do something differently, then that will perpetuate the kind of innovation, because you're not as frightened to fail. But if you don't see that, and you somehow work in an organization where failure is punished or seen as a negative, then how are you going to innovate?
Yeah. So the way back, I think in the first question, you mentioned the idea of how beneficial like having some of this kind of built and come up through the business as opposed to always being IT led. And you mentioned kind of having the right guardrails in place for that. Can you share a little bit about like what are some of those guardrails, or like pieces of the puzzle that should be considered if you want to really encourage this kind of like from the business bottom up innovation mentality?
We will live in a world where there's so many systems that allow the business and or people outside of IT to deliver change. And I think one of the guardrails I would like people to consider, or I've seen work, is when that change happens, but I'm working IT, so I'm going to say this, kind of like there's sort of a neglecting of some basic IT principles. Like you're going to have, just because you can configure something, you're going to have to test it. So like, can we make sure there's a bit of a testing process? And clearly what we live in financial services risk environment. Before you publish a change of rates to a production environment that's going to impact insurance policies you're going to write, you probably want some authorization process, but it needs to be designed to be the right authorization process. Who needs to be involved? What's the level of change? But in that, why not build a system that says, okay, you have authorization, and there's guardrails built into the system that says you can do any change up to 5% of the rate. And therefore the risk is only ever 5% plus or minus of what the current rate is. And so that enables people the safety net to allow them to try things out. Obviously, if you want to do a change that's greater, then you might have a different authorization process. So remember some IT principles. I've worked on a project where the business got in a third party to build all their documents, and they turned up with a loads of business analysts. So they built some great documents, but they didn't work because no one had tested them, no one had thought about different scenarios. They just executed on it. So we need to think about how you're going to do that sort of change. And then when it actually comes to things that are going to impact the client, impact the customers, or impact anything related to the compliance or the legality of what you're doing from an insurance perspective. Working insurance is going to be insurance. You've got to think about then those guardrails that allow for change and innovation, but also protect you as a business. And that's what we're seeing with some of the sort of thinking about, I can't go on any podcast without mentioning AI, but think about AI or machine-led rating and pricing, making sure that the decisions that the AI is making machines can only be within the guardrails of what you allow it to make, so that you don't suddenly lose all your business because the AI thinks you need to charge $1 million or £1 million for your car insurance, or all the way around, you don't want it to be giving it away for under £1. So this is where you kind of like the IT and IT systems can provide those practical guardrails from a technology perspective, but then organizations can provide the tracks for you to work in by allowing, making sure that we've got the right principles and the right operating model that support the amount of change that you want to do, and especially for organizations that want to be more nimble. And that's where, again, that's how I see it. And I've known the organization I touched on earlier, which around their change to their rating service, what we did is that they had one big monolithic rating engine that they used. And when we worked with them, and they broke it down into somewhere in the region of 240 individual steps, each which could be changed. And therefore, individual teams and individual people within teams had authorization to change those individual tiny little steps, but only very few people could change the fundamental way that the model worked. And that's how they were able to go from changes every few months to changes in multiple changes within a day, because they had those guardrails in place, and the systems that we created in place enabled that level of change. And we see that with the systems that we implement. We've got the same sort of concept that we have with the systems that we've got working in Instanda now, in a no-code solution, which allows people to make their own changes, but there are still those checks and publishing and guardrails around what can be done, where it's done, allowing for testing cycles before it ever gets out to be something in the live that could impact the way that your business is performing.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for the discussion, Kevin. And for everybody who watched, make sure that you go and you follow him on LinkedIn. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for the discussion. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.